Greetings all, and welcome to lucasprues. In today's video, we're going to have a build and review of the 1/72nd scale Italeri ME 410 A-1 hornisse. So this is their recent reissuing of their old tool of this kit, which they brought out at around about the same time as the new Airfix kit. So I've previously done an inbox review looking at the contents of this box, so if you want to have a look at that, I'll leave a link in the description and in the cards. But for now, let's get into building. First of all, I give all the sprues a wash in some warm soapy water to remove any oil or residue from the plastic and help any paint or glue later on adhere to the model. I then use my side cutters to carefully trim away the cockpit parts and the fuselage halves from the sprue. Once they're removed, I then use my knife to carefully carve off any excess sprue from the finer parts, and I use some very fine sandpaper to remove any of the seam lines or excess sprue, before then using some Revell Contactor Professional to glue the control column, instrument panels, seats, and the radio bulkhead to the main cockpit tub. The instructions said to glue the rear gunner's seat to one of the cockpit walls, but I would later on shift it slightly forward. Next, I cut out the engine cowlings, which come in two halves, along with the exhausts, the two radiators for each engine, and all of the parts for the propellers. I glued the exhausts to the engine nacelles, followed by the radiators, and then set them aside to dry. Meanwhile, I cut out and clean up the lower wing and the two upper wings, and the internal landing gear bay floor and two radiators for each wing. The leading edges of the wings required some light sanding to remove the seam line before the radiators were then installed and holes were drilled out using a needle for the fuel tanks or the rockets which are included in this kit. I glued the landing gear bay floor to the lower wing and then glued the upper and lower wings together. The wings fitted alright, although there were a few gaps, especially on the leading edges of the wing, which would later require some putty to fill them in. While the parts dried, I used some bulldog clips to hold them together. Before gluing the two cowlings together, I placed the propeller hub part in between them and then glued them together so that the propeller would spin. The parts for the cowlings fitted together perfectly with no gap, although there was a fair bit of flashing on the radiator intakes which would have to be removed later on with a knife. As I mentioned earlier, I repositioned the gunner seat slightly aft before then removing some of the flash that was present around the cockpit on each of the fuselage halves. Admittedly, the Italeri 410 is pretty basic in its details, especially for the cockpit and its sidewalls, so I decided to upgrade it slightly using some 1mm Tamiya masking tape to create a bit of internal ribbing. I also used some spare bits of sprue to create extra details, especially for the floor in the rear gunner's compartment, and also to add some fuse boxes. Some additional pieces of sprue were also used to add the throttle and oxygen controls, along with some extra bits of metal wiring for the various cables in the cockpit and for some of the small levers. I used super glue for gluing the metal wire into place, and once it was in position I would then trim away the excess with my side cutters so that the parts would fit. I used a small needle to add some extra detail to the circuit breakers on the fuse box, and further wiring was then added to the floor of the gunner's compartment and behind the pilot's instrument panel based on reference photos. The interior was now ready for a little bit of painting. I painted 3 coats of Tamiya XF24 dark grey on the visible areas of the cockpit and also inside of the landing gear bay. Once it had dried, I then used several colours and a fine SMS brush to paint the finer cockpit details. Firstly, I used Vallejo's flat black to paint the controls on the sidewall, the main instrument panels, some of the metal wiring, and I also dabbed small black dots onto the circuit breaker panel to create some extra detail. XF22 RLM Grey was then used to paint some of the details on the cockpit floor, followed by Vallejo's Vermillion Red, which was carefully applied onto some of the circuit breaker panel, and also the raised details on the radios and the buttons and switches inside of the pilot's area. Vallejo Flat Yellow and Vallejo Deep Sky Blue were also used for various levers and also the dials as well as wiring. Unfortunately, there are no instrument decals included for any part of the cockpit, so you have to paint the gauges by hand. To do this, I dabbed some Vallejo flat white over the dials and dab it into the centre of them, and once that is dried, I then dab a little bit of flat black over the top, leaving a bit of white in some of the areas to give the illusion of them being instruments with some white markings on them. There are seatbelt decals included, but they were pretty basic, and I actually misplaced mine at some stage, so I didn't end up putting them in. XF52 Flat Earth was used to paint the pilot seat cushion and headrest, though later on I repainted the headrest with Tamiya X-1 Gloss Black. The Gloss Black was also used to paint the strange leg rest cushions that are present in the ME410 cockpit. I painted some additional raised details in the cockpit with Vallejo silver, and then to give the impression that the gauges were behind glass, I dabbed a little bit of Vallejo's gloss varnish onto the dials to give them a very subtle but still effective, shiny and reflective look. And finally, the cockpit was ready for a little bit of weathering. I used another fine SMS brush to dry brush some Tamiya XF16 flat aluminium onto the raised areas on the cockpit sidewalls, and other areas like the seats and the floor where the crew were most likely to scratch the paint off while using the aircraft. After I'd applied the flat aluminium, I let it dry for a while, and then repeated the same technique using a fine brush, this time to dab some XF24 dark grey, which was the same colour used for the base. This helps to tone down the chipping and gives it a little bit more of a subtle effect. The last bit of weathering I did was give the cockpit a coat of Tamiya Black Panel Line Ascent. This enamel wash is applied to create some extra depth in the recessed details, and it also gives the cockpit a slightly darker and more grungy and weathered appearance. In some areas, the enamel wash was a bit too dark for my liking, so I used a cotton tip dipped in a little bit of enamel thinners to help remove the excess panel liner. I then set the cockpit aside to dry and turned my attention back to the wings. I gave the leading edge a good sanding with some fine sandpaper to remove any remnants of any seam lines, and then I glued the two engine cowlings to the wings. The fit on these parts was pretty good, so I then cut out the propeller blades and gave them a little bit of a clean up again with some sandpaper. Someone in my inbox review on this kit pointed out that these blades are not quite accurate to the thickness of the real ones on the 410, and you definitely can notice that they are a bit too narrow when they are glued into place. So this is a bit of an unfortunate fault with the older Italeri kit. Nevertheless, I decided to still use them, so I cut them out and glued the spinner fairing into place, and then with the enamel wash dry, I sanded back the edges of the cockpit tub so that the glue would have a surface free of paint to stick to, and then I glued the cockpit to the left fuselage half. Despite all of the wiring and modifications I'd made, the cockpit fitted very well into place, so I then glued the other fuselage half together, which fitted very well. I used some bulldog clips and a little bit of Tamiya masking tape to hold the halves together while they dried, and also at this stage glued the wings to the lower fuselage. There was a bit of a gap between the wings and both the upper fuselage and also the lower fuselage, but nothing a little bit of putty couldn't fix at a later date. I cut out both the horizontal stabilizers, which are molded as a single piece for each side, and then glued them to the fuselage. They fitted okay, but the joints were too small and weak to hold them at the correct angle relative to the fuselage, so while the glue dried I used two bulldog clips to hold them in place. Next I added the iconic machine gun barbettes. The turrets for these can be glued into any position facing further up or down, though I used a bit of blue tack to hold them in place rather than gluing them so that I could potentially move them if I wanted to do an animation with this aircraft. I decided to also leave the machine guns until later after I'd painted the fuselage to make it a little bit easier. I continued to assemble the undercarriage and the tail wheel, first by cutting out the struts and giving them a clean up, before gluing them and the tail wheel into position, followed by the struts. Being more familiar with the BF110, where the wheels are on the outside of the landing gear struts, I actually glued the left strut to the right side and vice versa, which explained why the doors for the landing gear weren't fitting very well when I first tried to apply them. Fortunately, I would later notice and fix this. The doors for the tail wheel, meanwhile, fitted nicely into place, and then I cut out the main wheels, which come as two halves for each wheel. After gluing the halves together, I sanded down the seam line on them before gluing them to the struts. At this point, I noticed the 410 looked a bit odd, and after looking at photos, realised I had the struts the wrong way around, so I pulled them off and then re-glued them on the correct side. At this stage, I decided to add some metal wiring to the rudder pedals and also to the rear of the instrument panel to add some electrical wiring before gluing the nose to the main fuselage, which unfortunately didn't fit very well. Since the kit included the A-1, which is the light bomber version of the 410, I was originally going to do the bomb bay doors open, so I assembled and installed the parts to make the bomb rack. Though later on I decided to instead just glue the bomb bay door shut because the detail in the bomb bay was very lacking in this kit. With most of the assembly complete, save for the annoying small bits which were likely to get knocked off during painting, I got out some Vallejo water-based putty and began to use a cocktail stick to apply a coat of the putty over the seams between the fuselage halves, along the seams between the fuselage and the wings, along the massive gap between the nose and fuselage, and also along the leading edges where the wing halves met. After the putty had dried, I used a file and some sandpaper to gradually sand it down so that it was nice and smooth. The sanding process softened the recessed panels on the rear fuselage, so I used some masking tape to help create a guide and then used a scribing tool to carefully rescore the missing panel lines. I also redid some around the nose section. Further sanding was done inside the cockpit, and after removing the tape and redoing even more of the weaker panel lines around the wings, the aircraft was ready for some painting. Although you were given 4 different schemes in this kit, they are all of the standard 1944 Luftwaffe Dayfighter scheme, which consists of the standard German colours at the time of RLM 74 and 75 on the upper surface, and RLM 76 on the undersides. I decided in the end to go with Scheme A since it's featured on the box, has some nice yellow markings, and it would give me a nice chance to do a fair bit of the notorious German mottling along the sides. When I hand paint, I like to start with the lightest colour, which is in this case the underside being RLM 76 Variant 1. For my German colours, I like to use AK Interactive's water-based acrylic paints because they use the German colour codes, seem to be pretty accurate or at least produce colours I'm satisfied look German, and they are of good quality, especially when thinned down with a bit of water and applied in several coats to build up many layers, rather than thickly applied with no thinning in only 1 or 2 coats. Although hand painting takes a lot of time since you have to do several coats to get a good result, it's what I'm most experienced in, and currently I haven't really got the time and space to research, set up, and then learn how to use an airbrush system well, but it is something I want to do eventually. For now, I apply about 4 coats of RLM 76 using water to thin the paint and applying it from nose to tail using a brush in the same direction as much as possible to help reduce any brush marks. After the 4th coat, I have a much more uniform and smooth looking layer of the lighter blue, so I move on to the lightest colour on the upper surface, which is RLM 75. I give the paint a good shake and mix it with some water and apply it in virtually the same fashion as I did with RLM 76. You'll notice how I use a larger brush to reduce the number of brush strokes on the larger areas such as the wing and the horizontal stabilizers, but for the fuselage and the tail I use a smaller brush since the area is much more small, and I also wanted a more accurate line for the camouflage pattern. After about 3 coats of RLM 75, I then move on to the darker and more green RLM 74. I still mix the paint with some water to make it nice and thin and help it flow more, but this time instead of doing the wider areas, I apply it instead in the shape of the camouflage pattern. I carefully create the outline first for each shape, and then quickly fill it in and repeat this process until I've added all of the darker shapes for the pattern based on the colour guide. German camouflage tends to be a lot sharper and applied in splinter-like patterns, so a steady hand is required, although some people like to use masking tape instead to help get the nice sharp edges. I find I'm able to make the shapes reasonably sharp by hand myself, and if I make any mistakes, since the layers of paint are pretty thin, I can easily repaint a layer with the lighter colour and fix up any mistakes. I do 3 coats of the darker RLM 74, and by the end of it the shapes are much darker and more uniform. I do a coat of RLM 75 to then neaten up any edges, and then it's time for the fun part, the mottling. Mottling is one of a modeller's worst nightmares, and I know many people refuse to do it without an airbrush, but I've found using AK paints a way to get pretty reliable and decent hand-painted modelling results. My brush painting technique is to apply the shapes for the modelling, first using heavily thinned down RLM 76 and 75, which is dabbed on to create the pattern along the areas where I want the modelling. When I apply it, I try to keep the size, shape and position of the marks a bit random until I have filled in the space. I then soften the effect using a thin coat of RLM 76 over the modelling. When I apply the 76, it's almost the same consistency of water. Fortunately, the AK paints seem to be a little less likely to become runny and out of control when compared to the Tamiya or the Vallejo ones, but you do still have to take care when applying them. The RLM 76 takes a while to dry, so in the meantime I paint the propeller spinners and the tyres on the landing gear a few coats of Vallejo black. I found on the ME410 the modelling was a bit too small and subtle, so I did a second coat of applying the thinned down RLM 75 and 74 blobs, this time making the paint a little bit less watered down so it was a bit thicker and darker, and also applying larger shapes in certain areas to get a bit more variety. I definitely suggest playing around with the size and shape, and also how thick the paint is when you're applying your modelling. While the RLM 74 and 75 modelling dried, I painted the blades of the props with some AK Interactive RLM 70. After another thin coat of RLM 76 over the modelling, I was then satisfied with the effect that I'd created, and moved on to add another layer of black on the tyres and spinner before starting to paint the yellow markings using Vallejo flat yellow. I find that yellow is a real challenge to paint, much like white, since they are both very light colours, so require a lot more layers before they become uniform. Sometimes I find that I apply the paint a little bit too thick and end up with a few brush marks, as you can see with the band at the back of the fuselage. Fortunately, the Vallejo yellow is reasonably forgiving, especially compared to Tamiya's flat yellow, although I may try some other brands at some point for this particular colour. In between painting around about 3 coats of RLM 70 on the propeller blades and God knows how many coats of flat yellow on the engine cowling and fuselage, I also paint the white spiral on the spinner. Although there were decals included for this, I find it easier to instead carefully paint them using a fine brush and some thinned down Vallejo flat white. I carefully paint out the shape of the spiral, looking very closely at reference pictures to get the shaping correct, and once I've done it, I then apply a little bit of black to clean up any mistakes I've made. I finished up the yellow markings with a final coat, and then used some more of XF24 dark grey to repaint the cockpit, which had had a little bit of putty and several other colours of paint applied over some of the original layers, and then I applied a bit of the XF22 RLM grey on the landing gear struts and in the radiators. I carefully painted the hub for the wheels with Tamiya X1 gloss black, and I applied a second coat of XF22 on the struts, followed by a little bit of XF16 flat aluminium for the tail wheel and the large antenna that's on the underside of the fuselage. With the painting completed, I began to apply the decals, first by cutting the massive sheet into more manageable sections, and then sticking them in a little bit of warm water, and after a few seconds removing them and using a brush to slide them onto the model. Being cartograph decals, they were of exceptional quality, being thin and detailed, without any of them tearing, folding or flaking when I applied them. I didn't bother with any decal softener and instead simply applied a bit of Tamiya Decal adhesive just to help them stick to the model surface, and then I left them to dry for a night. The next day I used a brush to apply some Vallejo matte varnish, which I wooded down first slightly to make it a bit more thinner and flow more easily. I started adding matte varnish to my models more recently after decals to help remove any glossiness from them and help blend them to the same finish as the rest of the model, making them look like they were painted on. Once the varnish had dried, it was then time for some weathering. Looking at reference pictures of various ME410s, they still have a lot of the same kind of weathering as most well-used warbirds, though none seemed particularly worn out, so I decided to try and keep mine relatively clean. I know, shocking for me. I started with the usual metal chipping using a fine brush to dry brush some XF16 flat aluminium. I apply it on areas more prone to paint wear, such as the leading edges of the wing, the tail, horizontal stabilizers, and the edges of the propeller blades, which are more exposed to air resistance and any small debris that might be in the air. I also applied some metal chipping along the edges of a few panel lines and on moving surfaces such as the landing gear doors, the bomb bay, and various control surfaces. Finally, I added a little bit to the areas around access hatches and handles, and also the walkways where regular maintenance or use by the crew could scratch off a bit of paint. I let the flat aluminium dry, and in the meantime painted the exhausts with 2 coats of X-31 titanium gold. I then dry brushed a thin layer of whatever colour of paint was surrounding the metal chipping in a particular spot, whether it was RLM 76 on the underside or the darker 74 and 75 on the upper surfaces or the yellow markings. By going back over the metal chipping, it creates a depth effect, making it look more like the metal is under a layer of paint, and it also helps to reduce the amount of chipping and thus tones down the weathering. Once the chipping had been toned down, I then moved on to adding a coat of Tamiya X-1 gloss black onto the wheel hub. At this point, I also added another layer of grey to the cockpit and added finer details into the cockpit such as the gunner's sight. I also added some extra detail with some spare bits of sprue, and I created a roll cage structure based on reference photos behind the pilot using a little bit of metal wire and some super glue. The canopies were then removed from their sprue, and the front windshield and small nose windows were then carefully glued into their positions. I then got out some XF24 and painted the raised frame details on the canopies, which were pretty nicely moulded. The dark grey acts as the interior colour for the framework since it is the first layer and the parts are clear. I apply it very carefully with a fine brush, and after it is dried, I then very carefully remove any mistakes with a cocktail stick, gently scratching off the paint since acrylic paint is relatively easy to scratch when it first dries. The gunner's sight, roll cage and other added cockpit details were painted various colours, including the base XF24 dark grey, as well as Vallejo flat black, XF52 flat earth and Vallejo silver for the finer details. I then paint the exterior colour onto the canopy frame, which was a mixture of RLM 75 and RLM 74 following the camouflage pattern. Finally, after removing any excess of the camouflage colours from the windows, the canopy frames were completed. Other fine details were applied to the model which I'd previously painted on the sprue, such as the machine guns, the antennas, and also the pitot tube. I don't normally add drop tanks or external weapons to my planes, generally keeping them clean, but I decided to add the drop tanks included in this kit for a change. I first cut them out, then cleaned them up with a little bit of sandpaper, put them together, and then after painting 3 coats of RLM 76 Variation 1 on them, I glued them to the underside of the wings. I then added their decals, and then it was time for the last bit of weathering. The enamel black panel wash made a glorious return for some external weathering. I applied it on the landing gear struts to highlight their details and also give them an oily appearance. I also used the wash to create some streaking from the airflow around the landing gear, radiators and the flaps. This creates some black streaking, which I then thinned down further using some enamel thinners, which fortunately doesn't affect the water-based varnishes or paints. Finally, I got out my Tamiya weathering master powders and used the black to add gun smoke and soot to the machine guns and to create some streaking out of the exhausts, and also along the areas on the wings in a slightly swirled pattern. I also used the black and rust colour to add more streaking, especially to the radiator and around control surfaces, and to create some fuel streaks on the drop tanks and on the hatches on the upper surface of the wing. A bit of black was used for some oil streaks around the spinner based on a few reference photos I found, and finally I thinned out the streaked powder using a little bit of water and a brush, and with that the Italeri ME 410 A-1 was finally completed. And here you can see the finished aircraft. Although it definitely has its fair share of faults, such as the lack of detail in the cockpit and bomb bay, a few misaligned parts such as the wings and more noticeably the nose section, and of course the misshaped propellers, I have to say I still greatly enjoyed making this kit, as I often do with German twin-engine aircraft. I'm really happy with how the modelling, matte varnish and more restrained weathering, or at least compared to what I normally do, have come together. Although I'm almost certain it's no match for the Airfix Me 410 in terms of quality and detail, it's almost half the cost, and it still has some decent detail and decent fitting in some areas, with 1 or 2 parts being the exception. It also has a pretty great choice of schemes and some very nice decals, but most importantly for me at least, in Australia you can actually get it. Whereas the Airfix kit is very difficult to actually find in stock at any point in time, so as a result I have not yet been able to get an Airfix 410, so I don't want to jump to too many conclusions about a comparison, but one day I definitely will do an Airfix one and be able to do so. But if you are looking for a cheaper and more available alternative that still captures the general essence of the ME410 in 1/72nd scale, this is still, I reckon, despite its flaws, a good choice, and it's nice to have it back on the market. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel to help things out. A massive shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund buying the products and the kits that I make for the channel, and also for helping out with larger projects such as my Milne Bay animation, which I have nearly finished writing the script for. Hopefully in the next month or two I will start doing some actual voice work with some people, and hopefully it won't be too long after that where I actually start getting into filming, but there's been a lot of kits being worked on, and there'll be plenty of videos coming up. But otherwise, thanks again, and until the next video, as always, take care and model on.